This episode is presented by Invest Puerto Rico. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place.
Hello and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is Friday, November 22nd, 2024. I'm Kirsten Korosec, and joining me today are my fellow TCers, Devin Coldewey and Margaux MacColl. What's going on, you two?
Oh, I saw some otters today.
Interesting. Not anything to do with tech, but appreciate it.
I didn't realize it had to be tech. I was going to say I walked my cat.
Oh, okay. Two amazing animal moments, but we should probably get into the show. Today, we have deals of the week covering surveillance drones, an everything store of biotech LLMs. I cannot wait for Devin to give us the lowdown on that. And how the age of AI is giving us a new risk factor in IPO S1 docs. Okay, insidery, but relevant. And then we're going to get into why current AI scaling laws are forcing labs to change course. And what I'm really looking forward to is network states 2.0.
Are we already on 2.0?
Oh, yeah.
Hell yeah, we are.
Before we get into the first deal, which is a story that I believe Margaux wrote about, I did want to mention that there had been some reports about this, and now we have final confirmation. The Department of Justice has argued that Google should, in fact, divest of its Chrome browser as part of a remedy to break up the company's illegal monopoly in online search. A couple of things. This does not mean it's happening. It needs to be resolved. We have plenty of court hearings in our future to be following. I did want to mention the best suggestion on Blue Sky after we posted the story. One of my followers suggested that The Onion buy Chrome, which I thought was amazing.
I support it. We can lend them the money. The press is really, really rich, so we can just lend Onion the money to buy Chrome.
Should we just buy Chrome?
Yeah, we should. We should definitely buy Chrome, and then it will, we'll solve all of media's problems by actually boosting quality journalism.
Pure consolidation. I do think it's interesting seeing this actually happen in the courts, and Amit Mehta is a very smart judge, as far as I can tell. I seriously doubt that Chrome is going to be completely disconnected from Google, but this is the kind of thing where you put it on the table, and it's so scary to Google and whoever that they're like, oh, well, what if we did this instead? And they're like, oh, well, Chrome can exist in a siloed thing, and we will disconnect our tracking cookie, technology. They do all this stuff in a panic to prevent it from happening. So I think it's more of a let's put our power on the table here and be like, we could, but do we need to?
Yeah. My goal in this, I'm not in the room negotiating, obviously, but if I had a wish fulfilled, it would just be that the search gets better. Because it's been in a downward spiral for a long time.
The worse it gets, it's no longer a monopoly. If everybody is just like, this is terrible, they will no longer have a monopoly. So it kind of solves itself. Maybe that's what they're doing. It's some 7D chess.
Yeah, it is 7D chess. Speaking of which, I did want to mention Wiz. They turned away from a possible acquisition from Alphabet. And by the way, Ingrid just had a great scoop, which is that Wiz has now gone on to acquire Daz for $450 million to expand its cybersecurity platform. You have to check out that story. But man, Wiz just seems smarter and smarter for avoiding that acquisition now, because a lot of the complaints around Google and Alphabet in general is this sort of monopolistic behavior.
Well, if you have enough money to buy another company ending in Z for $450 million, I don't think you need to worry about getting bought.
Yeah, absolutely. So other deals, Margaux, I want to toss it to you. And this is all about surveillance drones. And big surprise, you're writing about dual use once again.
I actually did not write this piece.
Oh, you didn't? Okay.
I want to give a shout out to Mike Butcher in Anaheim, who did write this piece. But it's a company called Together. They raised $74 million for dual use drones. For me, what's interesting about this deal is that they're based in Portugal. They were invested in by the NATO Innovation Fund. And one thing that one of the investors said, part of the appeal was that it was, quote, fully European. I've been following the European defense tech scene pretty closely because US-based companies have had a really hard time breaking into it. Anduril and Palantir execs have both really lamented the fact that European countries only seem to want to give contracts to European companies. So When I first read this deal, my first thought was, oh my God, another drone company. But at this point, I think being based in Europe is kind of its own competitive advantage.
No, I agree. I mean, we've had that, oh, Europe only wants to buy from Europe. It's like, okay, yeah, but US only wants to buy from US. Asia likes to buy from Asia.
For sure.
Everything's getting kind of balkanized or like regionalized for, I think, good reason. It makes sense as far as like defense contracts and stuff. So I'm interested in seeing how these things develop individually and whether they kind of converge. You know, like in evolution, everything eventually becomes a crab, right? I wonder if all these drones will eventually get the same type of features. They'll use the same protocols. They'll use the same little landing prongs or whatever. I'm curious about how they'll sort of co-evolve.
By the way, thank you for the visual of the hellscape of like drones all coming together into some sort of transformer crab, which is exactly what just popped in my head while I was listening to you.
I hope that happens too. Well, one from every region. 7 different, continental drones all joining together, Voltron-like.
Oh, amazing.
Well, one of the things TechCover is developing is a big drone that can carry a bunch of tiny drones and then release a swarm.
It's already happening.
Yeah. See, also total hellscape. Can't wait for that movie. But I did want to bring up something actually important and not, fictional. I find it interesting that the NATO Innovation Fund is, if I heard you correctly, mostly investing in European companies, but NATO includes the US. So what is going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I can't confess to have a ton of background on the NATO Innovation Fund. I assume the partner that did the investing was Europe-based.
I mean, it's the North Atlantic Trade Organization, right? But the US is just one of the, I don't know what they call them, partners or members or whatever. There's kind of a share and share alike. And does the US really need investment from hey, everybody in NATO, why don't you chip in a little bit so the US can finally develop a drone system? And they're like, are you kidding me? You're the richest country in the world. Get out of here.
True. And also, the Department of Defense has quite a large budget. So they have plenty to be able to, on the dual use side of things, certainly invest in all sorts of different technologies, from autonomous vehicles and drones to all sorts of fun stuff. Do you see this, before we move on, as sort of like a European defense tech boom, or is this just a smattering of deals?
There's definitely a European defense tech boom. I think you're seeing it obviously in parallel with the US defense tech boom, but also the fact that Ukraine and Israel are much closer to Europe. They're involved in those wars to varying degrees. It's closer to European borders, and they want European companies to be deployed in those wars.
Yeah, if you're an EU member state, a NATO state, this is happening in your backyard. And there's a tremendous amount of investment and innovation in the defense space in Europe because they can't rely on US drones. No, they need to have European built ones and have it all be local.
All right. And I think we're going to probably see more of that happening throughout the world. Completely moving into an entirely different direction is a story about Converge Bio, which has built an everything store, which I love that phrase, for biotech LLMs. They raised $5.5 million in a seed round. But Devin, I want to understand. Please break down what exactly is Converge Bio doing here.
Well, the everything store, I think that's the way they put it. But the issue is, you have all these large language models, ChatGPT and stuff like that. Those are all trained on the English language, literature, the internet. But the same model type, they just find patterns in long strings of data. So the biotech world has been looking at these models as ways to understand and interpret and generate interesting data like genomes, like protein sequences. There's been lots of really interesting work with it. But this is increasingly a problem that the models come out, they get trained. They have these huge foundation models that get trained, but they're kind of stupid. They're general purpose. They're not trained to do anything in particular. They're just giant pattern identification statistics things. And it's really hard to make them do something in particular. Like with ChatGPT, you need to make it polite. You need to make it helpful. You need to make it not, repeat conspiracy theories, stuff like that. That takes a lot of post-training. And so what Converge Bio is doing, the post-training work for the foundation models in biotech that already exist. So if you have a foundation model, it's all about DNA, RNA, protein-protein interactions, whatever. But you need it to be more specific to this antigen or this system or, this pathology. They provide a way to further train the LLMs and also let them explain themselves a little better. So they're trying to put together that service for biotech.
All right. So if I'm hearing it correctly, then how would their business model work? Would biotech company X come to them and say, hey, we would love a customized tool to achieve this purpose. And then Converge would do this sort of bespoke LLM for them? Or is it more automated than that?
It's a little bit of both. It's more like if I'm a pharmaceutical research company and I work in antibodies because I make vaccines or whatever, right? There are large language models out there that are focused on antibodies and stuff, but I don't know how to use them because they are very general and weird. And I need to train it on also my internal data. So what Converge does is uses the proprietary data to enrich the large language models and fine tune it and making it something that you specifically as a company can find useful and that your researchers can just use like a lab tool. At least that's the idea. So yeah, the pharmaceutical company would come to them and say, here's what we need. Here's where we work. Here's the data. And Converge says, great, give us $1 million and we will make this available to you.
Interesting.
That's the general idea. There are companies that are working in this space already, lots of them. But
that was going to be my last question. Like, there are a few phrases in the venture world that I am not a fan of. And one of them is, what is the moat? But if there's a lot of competitors out there, like how are they different here? How do they have a chance to compete?
I don't, work directly in this space, but when you think of like Ginkgo Bioworks, whatever, like these are already working in the machine learning and large language model biotech space, but they're a little more full service and they're a little more like we're building an entire foundation model that you can use on our platform. Whereas Converge is like, hey, there are foundation models out there that anybody can download and use, but we will let you use it as your own on your own data. And you own everything about it. It's a little more of a roll your own solution rather than like providing a full service thing.
Got it.
And they think that they can acquire earlier customers in that way, ones that aren't going to go and spend, $1 million a month, but they can afford $100,000 once to fine tune one model. I don't know. But they're trying to get in early with the more than half of these biotech companies have no experience whatsoever with machine learning and foundation models. So they're like, look, we'll get you in there early and then lock you in as a customer.
Awesome. Well, I have a question for Margaux that is not about biotech. And I'm just wondering if, like myself, when I'm looking to relax at night, I cozy up by the fire and I open up an S1 and I read the risk factors of whatever recent IPO.
They're honestly really fun. I get excited when a company files
I'm
their
not
S1.
being sarcastic, although like the fire part, I live in the desert. It's not that cold here. But I will say this, one of my favorite things about an S1, which is, the prospectus that a company that's going to go public files, and it finally reveals all the secrets and all the things you've always wanted to know, hopefully, is the risk factors section. And venture editor Julie Bort found a little fun thing when cloud service startup ServiceTitan filed for its IPO. In the risk factors, and Devin, you'll enjoy this, the company included some boilerplate warning that LLMs that help grow the business could lead to damage. And they specifically named Microsoft and OpenAI. First of all, Margaux, I'm wondering if you've come across this as a risk factor for any other IPO.
I haven't seen it. I don't know if you have. It was interesting. It was interesting to read. And it definitely made me think if this is going to be something that a lot of S1s have in the future.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just going to be this like standard language that there is a lot of standard language in a lot of these risk factors. And then the goal, of course, is to root through and find the really unique things for that particular business. It's like, ooh, but as far as I can recall, I have never seen this. And I'm wondering what the risk factor is here, or what the exposure to business is here, beyond the fact that an LLM could, create a hallucination or something incorrect. Is there anything else that you can think of, Margaux or Devin, beyond the hallucination part that would be an obvious risk?
Yeah, they mentioned sharing customers' private data with third-party companies and not the risk of security breaches for that.
Yeah, it's standard in a way with when you deal with third parties. If you're like, oh, we have to use a cloud provider and the cloud provider could get breached. I think it's a step beyond that with the AI stuff because it's not just hallucinations. It's also there's really unknown unknowns when it comes to AI security. There's all these novel ways of attacking LLMs and generative AI that people really don't know about. So it makes sense to step carefully when you're implementing it at scale. You want to say out front, like, this is a new and weird technology, and we don't really understand what the risks are, but we know that they probably exist. It ends up sounding pretty general, but I would expect to see that a lot more in these kinds of filings.
Can I ask, because I don't cover IPOs a lot, I tend to cover earlier stage startups. Could this be a sort of like forcing function for startups to use safer AI models, or to use, like, I know we were talking about Sierra, which is Brett Taylor's, which is AI like made for companies to not hallucinate and to be safer so that they don't have to put in language like this in their S1? Or is it kind of like, if it becomes standard, it becomes standard?
I think it's a little bit wishful thinking because, I mean, the risk factors is, imagine a team of lawyers going over every possible risk. And so even if there are solutions out there like Brett Taylor's, new company is trying to do, they're still going to put it in there because it's the what if.
Yeah.
But I think that, Margaux, you're right in that there will be, if the risk is stated, then, and it becomes standard to state it, then I think a solution will also become standard. And whether we have a regulation that requires it, or investors require it, or the lawyers require it, someone is going to say, oh, well, there are these unknown risks. And that's why we retain a pen testing startup that does specifically this kind of testing. And they give us an independent report every quarter on whether these things are vulnerable to this and that. And so you have it kind of built in. They say, well, we know there are risks, so we're taking this mitigation strategy that they might not otherwise have put in.
Well, we'll have to see how this plays out. And I will certainly be looking at every S1, although there haven't been a ton of them lately, to see if there are LLMs. After the break, we are going to talk about two really interesting things. One about current AI scaling laws, and also network states 2.0, as I'm calling them. And I can't wait to hear what Margaux has to say about that.
What's next in innovation? That's not the right question. It's where. Puerto Rico, more than just a tropical paradise, it's innovation's paradise, where startups and global players coexist in a vast and vibrant ecosystem, where talent runs deep, highly skilled and bilingual. Plus, the island offers the most competitive tax incentives in the U.S. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. Find out more at investpr.org/equity.
So I'm again going to turn to Devin to help me with this. But basically, we had a story about how current AI scaling laws are showing diminishing returns. And as a result, it's forcing AI labs to change course. So before we get into that, what are we talking about here? Let's start with the basics.
Laws?
What is laws? What is laws?
It really is very basic. Like it makes it sound really technical. I'm going to try to keep this brief because I want to talk about network states, which are so ridiculous. But like, think of like Moore's law. Moore's law was basically like every however long, 18 months or something, you double the amount of transistors on a chip. And that led to computers becoming faster and faster in an exponential way for many years. And every time that happened, it enabled new applications and so on. That's an example of a scaling law, and it was very reliable for a long time. So in AI, the scaling law that we've been working with is nowhere near as formal as Moore's law, but it's basically that the more parameters, which is the sort of like the amount of data that an AI model has to work with, the amount of parameters and the amount of like compute power that you put into training it, the better it is. And it was really unclear, let's say a year and a half ago, it was unclear whether as you go from like, 1 million to 1 billion to 1 trillion parameters and like a week of compute time to months and months of compute time on 1,000 times more computers, it wasn't really clear whether you would get exponentially better AI or sort of like at some point, it doesn't matter how much compute you throw at it, you'll only get like 1% better AI. And that's what actually people are sort of experiencing now. This is still very preliminary. It's not like, oh, AI is done. It's more like, we've been scaling AI. We've been making AI models better by making them bigger and by training them with more data. But we're running out of data. They already used all the data in the world and stole whatever else they could find and threw that in there too. And the compute is getting so expensive, it's ridiculous to try to say like, oh, we need 100 times more to get 10% more performance. So what they're finding is that there's other places that you can gain capability in the AI models. And it's not just by making the model bigger. The one that everybody is focused on right now is called test time compute, which is a fancy way of saying letting the model, for lack of a better word, think about the answer before answering. And this has been shown in various ways for a couple of years that if you ask one of these models to just answer a question, like a complex question, it'll answer. But if you say, break down the question into multiple like steps and show your work, then the model will take 10 times as long, but the answer will be way more reliably good. So it's like if you give it this room to move and calculate in a slightly more human-like way, and I can't stress enough that these are not thinking like people. It's just a matter of breaking down a prompt into sub-prompt. And so that's what OpenAI's O1 model is. But basically, making the models think more about the answer before they give you the answer. And that could be like it thinks for 5 seconds. It could be it thinks for a week and does like research, sends its little agent out to subscribe to the Financial Times and skim a few articles from the archive. I don't know.
All right. So I'm going to cut off the lesson.
All right.
No, I mean, it's just a lot to take in. But
I liked the lesson.
I know. But we don't have an hour-long podcast.
No, I know.
But I would say this, like, first of all, very interesting. And it just seems like this test time compute is starting to shape up, or at least being maybe marketed as such, as like AI industry's next big bet. And I'm wondering, Margaux, although I know you're not like as deep in the weeds necessarily on AI, if you're seeing anything percolating in what you're writing on the venture side.
I am going to take this answer in a tangent direction because
okay.
Well, the only conversations I really have about AI are in relation to foreign policy and defense. When I read this piece, the first thing I thought about was that I talked to a lot of big Silicon Valley China hawks, and they have really made a good living off of selling this idea that we are going to be in like an AI arms race with China. And when I read this and I'm like, okay, if the improvements in AI become a lot more incremental and we hit some sort of ceiling, what happens to that Cold War? We can't outpace China just flooding money and building data centers. What does that look like if there is sort of a ceiling where after that, it's pretty incremental improvements and our adversaries can relatively quickly catch up to that?
No,
you know what I mean?
That's absolutely, it's not tangential at all. It's super like central to the discussion. And yeah, that's absolutely what everybody's worried about. They're like, was the success in AI just a matter of how much money and how much H100s you could buy? If that's the case, then it's just a capital race. But if there is some level of research and ingenuity that has to be done, that's a different problem. And there's no guarantee that you can beat, China, for example, on any particular problem, but supposedly they're like 6 months behind. That's at least what that report from the China hawk, what's his name? The guy
Jacob Hellberg.
Yes, Hellberg. They were saying is about 6 months. China's about 6 months behind. Well, whatever. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But if you can stay ahead of the game and be like, oh, we're reaching the end of this scaling law and we're figuring it out before the adversary, that's a huge advantage.
Well, we could obviously have a whole entire show about this. I will say that it's right now, it seems pretty unclear how this test time compute is going to scale. And I did want to note before we move on to network states that apparently if it fails, there is one A16 partner who says that AI chips that specialize in high-speed inference could go up dramatically. We're not going to even let Devin comment on this because we could be here all day. He's laughing just for the folks that are listening.
I mean, it is potentially true. It could be because you need test time inference. That needs to be fast, needs to be low latency. You can't wait a month. You have to get it as fast as possible. So that is Cerebrus and stuff are going to go up.
Okay. Well, now finally to finish the show with network states. I think we're all like super interested in this, but Margaux, please, first of all, what's a network state?
God.
Great question. A network state is basically like an internet community in search of a physical community. So it's these digital groups that are in search of buying land. The way it's worked out is that those end up being like special economic zones. The dream is to like have their own country. And they've made a weird amount of progress, which you were the most famous ones. And I wrote about how last week he announced that he had like gone to Greenland to try to buy it. Really, he did what he's been doing for years now, which is he goes to countries that he thinks might be amenable to an influx of capital and entrepreneurs and try to convince them to let him build a city. And he's raised over 500 million in a weird way. It's basically a loan that he can take out at certain milestones. But theoretically, if he hits these milestones of building a real city, he's got $500 million that he can draw upon.
Okay. So backing up for a minute, first of all, I want to say that like the reason why I was saying network states 2.0 is because not that long ago, I forget which wave of cryptocurrency hype we were in, but at that point, there was a lot of activity around creating these like quote unquote utopian states centered around crypto. And so this seems like the second wave, but maybe we're more in like the third or fourth wave. I'm not really sure. My question for you is, you mentioned a moment ago that this isn't the first attempt of Dryden Brown to, try to buy uninhabited land. So has he tried with Greenland before? Or are you talking about like other areas?
For the past few years, he's been to like 30 countries. He told me, he was like, I just spam all the local government people on LinkedIn. And then I show up and I say, I will build a city here if you let me. I think right now they're looking at, originally he was looking at the Mediterranean. I think now they're leaning towards the Caribbean. Unclear where, but they had a big event in Dominican Republic. So that might be a hint.
These things are so weird to me. I mean, I understand why countries want to take, they're like, oh, some rich guy with, has $100 million that he wants to drop on some sort of utopia. Sure, come to the Dominican Republic. We'll buy you dinner and you can try to spend your $100 million here. I mean, it's just like getting a resort investment, because these projects are basically resorts for rich people that, have a Bitcoin vending machine in the corner. That's what I've seen so far. Like, there's nothing utopian about it. I have not personally built a utopia, but as far as I know, you need to start at the bottom and work your way up. You don't start with a bunch of rich people and put them in one place and then say, okay, it's utopia. You need to start by essentially like overpaying all the ground level, like workers, farmers, cooks, dishwashers, like making sure that everybody is being overcompensated because you at the top have too much money. And all these guys do is like go buy a like little plot of luxury land and say like, here we shall have our network state where all the rich people shall come once a year. And it's like, that's just a resort. It's just a hotel.
I like Devin's communist manifesto.
Okay, I was going to say, it does not sound at all very capitalist. You are fired from equity, by the way.
They really, what I found really interesting about my conversation with Dryden, I've talked to him, I think once before, but this time around, it was like right after Trump got elected, and he felt very emboldened. And he felt like having a Trump presidency was really going to help these network states, which is interesting because they're all abroad. And yeah, these guys, they view themselves as like cowboys going abroad and finding new land.
Before we wrap up the show, are there any successful ones? And if there are, what do they look like? I mean, what does that utopia look like? Is it just capitalism on steroids? Like, what is this utopia?
There is one in Honduras called Prospera, which is, they've got one kind of like resort building completed.
I just read about this. It's like it's a total scam.
It's not a scam in that they let you register your business there and you can pick from like 36 countries that you want to be regulated by. What do you mean? For rich people, it rocks.
Right. I should say it's not a scam as much, I mean, everything is a scam in capitalism, of course, but like this is like the ultimate. But seriously, I mean, like you have like Canary Islands and places like that are tax havens. That's, just have a tax haven. Call it a tax haven. That's what it is.
So first of all, Margaux, I think that, we should note for the audience that Devin has been planted here as the token contrarian. And actually, he's very pro-capitalist. You should see his house. It's insane. He's just like playing the part, and it's actually not true to his ideals at all.
It's a total act.
It's a total act. But please finish your thought. And then I want to mention one thing about crypto.
I was going to say the craziest part of Prospera is that they do like medical testing there. Like they had one guy that like got his Tesla key like embedded in his hand. Yeah, that's like not FDA approved. So
nice.
Rich businesses go there and you can get whatever implanted. So maybe that's a big plus for Devin.
Yeah, that's funny. The whole Tesla beat. I have encountered people who have embedded the key in their arms. But I'm really curious to see with the rise of crypto, especially those who have been emboldened by the new Trump administration, if we're going to see even more of these network states. It just seems like crypto is kind of having a moment. and we'll see how this evolves. In the near term, Rebecca Balan had a conversation recently with the founder of blockchain analysis startup Chainalysis about crypto post-election. So please check that out. I think there's some interesting insights in there. We are out of here. Thank you so much for listening to Margaux educate us on network states and Devin's extreme bias on capitalist society. Thank you too.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, thanks, comrades.
And on that note, Equity will be back next week. Until then, you can find Equity under the handle @EquityPod on X and Threads.
Equity is produced by Teresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Pickavett, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.